So another issue that we would like to address is the need to know the model and the reward function, right? Both in policy iteration and in value iteration, we're required to perform Bellman updates, right? And that requires us to know the probability of transitioning between states, and also it required us to know the reward function, what is the immediate reward that we'll expect to see from each state and action, from following each state and action pair. Obviously, we would like to drop that assumption. That's, in many cases, that's not a reasonable assumption. And so we will explore online learning approaches, reinforcement learning approaches. And then you might ask yourself, well, okay, in order to do such online learning, or to drop the assumption that we know the model and the reward function, we will need to somehow learn them, right? So you might ask yourself the question of how can we learn the model and the reward function just from interacting with the environment. But then actually there's a bigger question, which is do we even need to learn the model? So in order to perform policy iteration or value iteration as using Bellman updates, we do need to, as we defined them so far, we do need to know the probability, the state transition probabilities and the reward function. But you might ask yourself, can we also perform learning? Can we converge on V star or Q star without the models, or even perform policy iteration without a model? That is, can we maybe reduce the Bellman equation to work, or to eliminate the state transition probability and the reward function? And it might sound difficult, but actually we will be able to do that by considering expected values through samples. So we will get to that later on. And then another question would be, can we actually do without V star or Q star and run policy iteration? So actually I just said so. Can we do policy iteration without a model? And the answer is again yes, in this case. And I won't go into the details. We will see some interesting approaches, some interesting mathematical tricks that will allow us to do policy iteration without computing the state or action value, V star or Q star, right? Next issue that we observed when we apply value iteration or policy iteration, as we just saw it, is that it requires a discrete and a finite, obviously, set of actions. So in order to address that, right, and in many domains we don't have a discrete or finite set of actions. For instance, in robotics environment, in driving environment, where we have continuous control, right, between left and right, some continuous set of values that we can assign to our action. So we will later explore policy gradient approaches that are suitable for continuous actions, that in many cases require a policy approximator. In most cases, yes. We will discuss this later on. And we'll see some advanced approaches to do that, to learn continuous actions, or a policy that outputs continuous actions. And then you might ask yourself, well, if we learn specific algorithms to learn for continuous actions, will those approaches be relevant for discrete action spaces? That is, are we going to learn specific algorithms for each domain and for each domain setting? So in some cases, yes. So for instance, Q-learning algorithms are usually only applicable for discrete action spaces. However, the algorithms that we're going to learn for continuous action spaces, many of the state-of-the-art algorithms actually are applicable for continuous actions. They can be relevant also for discrete action spaces. How come? Because we can always define a continuous action space as a distribution over discrete action, right? For instance, using softmax function. So imagine that I only have two actions, right? Left and right. And then you say, well, you won't be able, so it seems like I won't be able to apply a continuous, or to train a continuous policy over such discrete action space. But that's not true, because I can always define the probability of going left or right as a continuous value, right? And I would say my action space is that probability. And I can tune that probability using continuous control algorithm. Can we also combine value-based approaches and policy gradient approaches and get the best of both? Right? So in many cases, as I said before, following your question, Baba, in some cases, which we will characterize later on, I don't want to go there now at the moment, value-based approaches will be more efficient, right? But as I said now, there are some issues specifically with Q-learning in continuous action spaces, right? Learning Q values for continuous action spaces. You could do that, but Q-learning becomes a bit more complicated, or extracting the policy or defining the policy over that becomes a bit more complicated. I don't want to go there now, right? We're just doing the basics. We'll get there later on. But in many cases, value-based approaches are preferred. So one might ask, okay, so can we combine the benefits of a value-based approach with policy gradient approaches that are more appropriate for continuous control? And the answer is yes. And we will see actor critique methods that actually combine both of these. And most of these are considered state-of-the-art approaches these days. And we'll see actually several ways to combine value-based learning and policy gradient-based approaches. We'll see various combinations, various actor critique architectures later on. So another issue that arises from the value iteration algorithms and policy iteration is that it might be difficult or even impossible to store the values or the policy, the preferred action, a full policy assignment over the entire state space. Why? Because most real-life problems contain very large state spaces that are practically infinite. So for instance, if your state space is defined by a front-facing camera, for instance, right? Probably there is a finite assignment of pixels, of RGB values per pixel, but practically it's infinite, right? All possible images that you might see, well, it's practically infinite. And so it is not feasible to learn and store values for every state, or the value can be an action, right? So to store a tabular policy. But as I said earlier, so there's another issue, is that not only is it not possible to store everything in memory, but also the learning becomes not meaningful. So you learn a value for a specific state, let's say you could do that. It tells you nothing about a state that is slightly different, right? So generalizing the knowledge becomes an important issue that needs to be overcome, right? So the chance of encountering exactly the same state in two different runs becomes practically zero. So for instance, again, if you have an autonomous vehicle with a front-driving camera as your state, the images define your state space, the probability that you'll see the exact same pixel assignment in two drives or between any two states is practically zero, right? So we'll have to somehow generalize our knowledge. And indeed, we will learn how to generalize our learning to apply to unseen states. And right, we'll be able to learn for the entire state space without even seeing the entire state space, but we'll need to somehow generalize our knowledge between states that might be probably similar to each other. In order to do this, we will use value function approximator. And these are very good at generalizing the acquired knowledge and providing a value to any state, right? So I can train a function that takes as input a state and outputs a value, and it will output a value for any state, even states that we've never seen before. However, it will require us to tune that function, right? To set it up correctly, or to train it correctly. Finally, some notation that we cover throughout this lecture and that we will continue with during this course. So this is a notation that you should feel comfortable with and should remember moving forward. So as a reminder, pi star is a policy that yields the maximal expected sum of rewards. By the way, is pi star dependent on the initial state? Which state we start from? Each one of the episodes?
Yes. No?
Well,
I don't know.
so, right, so one of your answers was correct. The answer is no. Pi star is independent of the initial state. That's why an MDP definition is not necessarily, so an MDP is not necessarily needs to require an initial state. Pi star is the same pi star regardless of the state that you start from. Why is that? Because of which property?
The Markovian property.
The Markovian property, that is correct. So pi star is, so the optimal action to take from any state is independent of the state that you've seen previously, right? So you can treat each state as the first state that where you just started, right? And it's the same. V star of S is the expected sum of rewards from being at state S and then following pi star, right? And again, V star again is independent of the where we started our episode from. V pi S, as opposed to V star S, so V pi S is the expected sum of rewards from being at a specific state S and following a specific policy pi that is not necessarily the optimal policy. Q star is a function of S and A, state and action pair. This is the expected sum of rewards from being at state S and taking action A, and then following pi star. By the way, A, so Q star function works for any SA pair, even for A that is not the optimal action to take from state S, right? So any SA pair. Q pi SA, similar to V pi, is the expected sum of rewards from being at state S, taking action A, and then following a specific policy pi. And this, we'll see this later on, both Q pi and V pi for what's called on-policy reinforcement learning methods. So we'll see some algorithms that try to learn Q star, some algorithms that try to learn Q pi or V pi in some cases. So we'll actually use these definitions in various cases moving forward. And as a reminder, G, capital G of T, is the observed sum of rewards following time step T. That is just a summation of immediate rewards that we've seen until the end of the episode. In most cases, we will not consider G, capital G of T, or we'll actually use capital G of T in order to estimate the expected sum of rewards, right? So we have highly stochastic environments. So if we do a single rollout, we'll travel through our environment, even if we follow a specific policy. Each time we sample a trajectory in our environment, we might see a different sum of rewards. Right? GT is just one of those, but in most cases we are interested in optimizing the expected G value. Right, and we'll have a different notation for that, but we'll discuss that later on.